A very good evening to our respective panelists and participants on behalf of Prinseps. The panel discussion for today is being attended by Ms. Radhika Gupta, who is the late Bhanu Athaiya's daughter, H.H. Maharani Radhikaraje Gaekwad of Baroda. She's a textile and a heritage custodian, patron, and researcher. Ms. Deepthi Sasidharan, director of EKA Archiving, and Ms. Deepshikha Kalsi, who is the founder of Textile Conservation Studio. So thank you so much to all of you for gracing us here with your presence. And for everyone, I'll just give a brief introduction to Bhanu Athaiya, who is the subject of today's discussion. So Bhanu was born in Kolhapur, Maharashtra in 1929. Over the years, she has contributed to Indian art, fashion, and design, paving the way for many talented designers. In 1982, she won the Oscar for Best Costume Design for Richard Attenborough's Gandhi, making her the first Indian to do so. In an interview, she recalls the difficulties in showcasing this entire work. 50 years of Mahatma's life in various locations. In South Africa, Gandhi was young and he changed over the years. It was difficult to capture the look. There were other sequences too, where hundreds of people in period costumes had to be used. She states, "You can well imagine the kind of study I undertook to create the look." So here we are, honored to be discussing the late Bhanu Athaiya. I would like to first invite, I would first like to introduce Ms. Radhika Gupta. Ms. Radhika Gupta is the daughter of late Bhanu Athaiya. She has spent most of her life researching crafts and was involved in innumerable handicraft-specific projects. She founded the first handicraft-based lifestyle store Habitat in Kolkata in 1993. She has trained local people with disabilities to create crafts, which were then retailed from the store. She's a member of the Richa Foundation, a Kolkata-based NGO that promotes folk and tribal heritage and pursues her passion for Indian handicraft as a consultant. She has played a key role as historical researcher in several important exhibitions. These included 150 Years of Kolkata Police and Nari, an exposition at Victoria Memorial on 300 years of women in Kolkata for the city's centenary. She has also helped set up the Kolkata Police Museum. Over the last 8 years, she has been working in Mumbai with her mother on the project closest to her heart, the preservation of her mother Bhanu Athaiya's 75-year-old legacy for posterity. About a year and a half ago, I think, Ms. Radhika Gupta consigned Prinseps the estate of Bhanu Athaiya. In November 2020, we had an art exhibition on the works by Bhanu, which was received very, very well. We are now documenting the costumes that are part of her collection and are also recently lucky to be researching and documenting the textiles that were inherited by her, along with the help of Ms. Maharani Radhikaraje Baroda. Thank you, ma'am, for gracing us with your presence today, and we welcome you to the panel. I would now like to introduce our second panelist for today, H.H. Maharani Radhikaraje Gaekwad Baroda. A master's in medieval Indian history, Radhikaraje worked as a journalist with Indian Express, New Delhi, prior to moving to Vadodara. Married into the royal Gaekwad family, she is now actively involved in running one of the largest private residences in the world, along with family trusts, such as the Maharani Chimnabai Stree Udyogalay, imparting vocational training to lower-income women, and the Maharaja Fateh Singh Museum Trust, housing some of the most acclaimed works of Raja Ravi Verma, amongst others. She is also patron of the Heritage Trust and director at CDS Art Foundation. Radhikaraje is currently also working on the documentation of the Lakshmi Vilas Palace, its priceless possessions, and reviving the lost old weaving techniques of Chanderi and Baroda Shalu, an intrinsic aspect of Royal Maratha sartorial traditions. She continues her love for writing by regularly contributing to leading readings and magazines, and has also recently documented the heirloom Bhanu Athaiya collection for Prinseps. We welcome you on the panel. Thank you. I would now like to invite our third panelist for today, Ms. Deepthi Sasidharan. Deepthi Sasidharan is an art historian, curator, and founder-director at EKA Archiving, a cultural advisory and works on heritage and museum projects across India with the government, private, and corporate clients. Deepthi has led projects that have been path-breaking in India, including setting up museums seminal exhibitions, and the creation of archives like those for Kalakshetra, Chennai, Mumbai Police, and Tata Trust Mumbai. A Fulbright Fellow, she has curated, spoken, and published extensively on 19th century photography and has worked on photography collections at IGNCA and IGMT New Delhi and Chamal Palace, Hyderabad, and several private collections. Deepthi lives in Mumbai and is the co-author of Indira, A Life of Courage and Treasures of the Deccan. We welcome you on the panel. I would now like to invite our last but not the least speaker, Ms. Deepshikha Kalsi. Deepshikha specialized in textile conservation from the Victoria and Albert Museum, UK, along with a specialized technical course in analyzing weave structures from CIETA, France. She has and continues to provide her textile conservation expertise to several eminent institutions of India and has been an integral part of several exhibitions, including Fabric of India VNA, Prakashi at National Museum, Amrapali Museum, Jaigarh Fort Museum in Jaipur, and Udaivilas Palace, Dungarpur. Thank you for coming today. So I think I can start with, after all your lovely introductions, I had to condense quite a few of them. Let me just say that because they were very, very long and full of amazing achievements. So I'm going to start with my first question is to you, Ms. Radhika Gupta, ma'am. Could you shed some light on your mother's childhood and the religious events? Like, what was her exposure to textiles?
She grew up in a very artistic household. Her father was very much into painting, sculpture, most of the creative arts, in fact. So the grounding started from there, and he used to encourage her mother also in embroidery and sewing and painting. So it began at that stage. Plus, she absorbed a lot from her surroundings because there were a lot of the talented painters in Kolhapur. It was really known as Kalapur those days because the Maharaja used to patronize artists, painters, musicians. So they were always there. And in fact, during Navratri, people of Alauddin Khan Sahib's disciples would sing there. So, and you know, she used to meet painters like Durandhar and Haldankar. They were part of her father's group. So they used to have interactions at home. And over weekends, these painters would set up easels in 3 different places. One was near the lake, one was in the courtyard of the Mahalakshmi temple, which, by the way, was known as Kolhapur was also known as South Kashi, because people used to go for pilgrimage there. So there was a lot of activity, a lot of toing and froing, and the colors and her own observation capabilities, I think, came to the fore, because whatever material her father fed her, she just seemed to gobble it up, whether it was books of embroidery or cinema. And when they used to go for weekends to these, even in the Maharaja's palace gardens, they used to put up easels there. In fact, once the painter Haldankar was requested to paint somebody from the crowd that had come, and a lot of them were very important people from Kolhapur. So he said he wanted to paint Baburao Painter. And in fact, my mother said that everybody was so taken aback by 2 greats facing each other and one posing for the other, that by the end of it, everybody was cheering like you would cheer at a music conference when a singer is singing well. So every time he threw a color shade on that and toned it in, my mother said that it was just bursts of color, and suddenly it was transformed into a magical canvas. She remembers that very, very clearly. And she was about 10, she said then. So these were the influences, plus my grandfather. There was most people at that stage did what they call Vidya Dan. and Madhukari. These were social systems that happened in Kolhapur, where you helped needy students with food, lodging, and training. So he had a couple of rooms kept aside in the house for people to come and paint. And my mother used to go and paint with them. So there was, with all these influences, plus the Western style books that he used to bring from Mumbai. So there was enough fodder for her to sponge up.
And so constant creative exposure that was there right from.
And her personal curiosity. That was because, I mean, there were 6 sisters. None of them went into this field. So, I mean, obviously it was an inherent urge and passion with her.
So how did she then end up going to, JJ College of?
Well, because she painted very well in school, and her art teacher, she had different art teachers coming to train her in different forms of art, like cut work and painting and powder painting. So there was a famous painter called Mandre, Chandrakant Mandre, who later went on to become a film actor. He also, she's watched him work. So he said that because she was so good at it, and there was a painter, Deodhar, who was there also. So he had something to do with the JJ School of Art. And he suggested that, why don't you take her and try to put her in there? By then, her father had passed away, and the family had run into fairly hard times. So the mother said, fine, you go along. And she was extremely supportive, her mother. And they came to Mumbai, but unfortunately, the admissions had closed. They were late. So
she missed a year, and then she
missed. So she only did 2 years at the JJ. She did 1 year at Nutan Kala Kendra, and which is near Sandhurst Bridge, near Opera House. It used to be located there. Then she even did some, when she stayed as a PG in Dadar, she went for classes and art exams to the Dadar Art College. So she kept appearing for exams and honing her skills. So that's how she, and then when she came to GJ, she also got the gold medal. And there were people like Gaitonde and Raza. So they were all there. They knew, they recognized her talent, presumably. And they invited her to join them as the only female member of the Progressive Artist Group. So that's how she...
I think that's something that we've really highlighted during the auction that took place in November, that, there's this woman artist who was part of it, that many don't know the entire history and the depth of the modern Indian artist at that time, and what an integral part and role she did play. So I think what's also interesting, and we would love to know from you, is that, did she, so she's building this entire art and creative, artistic style to her. And then so how does she come into the world of costumes? Is it by accident, or is it?
Well, she knew, they were financially strapped. So she knew she had to earn money from day one when she came to Bombay. And she would give art classes. And then the lady she met here, Hima Devi, who was a very well-known personality in theatre. In fact, my mother wrote to her when she was coming to Mumbai and said she had no place to stay. And Hima Devi had met her in Kolhapur because her husband was posted in Kolhapur, and was very impressed by my mother's talent and said, please come and stay with me. So Hima Devi's mother was assistant editor at a magazine called Fashion and Beauty. So she took her along there, and she immediately got a job as an illustrator. And then the next year, the Eve's Weekly was launched by Bowman Bayram. So she moved on to that, and her fashion illustrations took the city by storm. because she brought in all the traditional motifs and adapted them to a changing India post-independence. It had just, those were the years when everything was, there was so much activity, there was so much enthusiasm. So that's how, and then because people like Kamini Kaushal and Nargis wanted her designs copied, they approached the editor of Eve's Weekly and said, start a boutique. So she started a boutique, which was very near Mazgaon. And there, people like Yash Chopra, B.R. Chopra would come. And that's how B.R. Chopra offered her the first film. So, and then she was quite sure that that was the world for her, because the canvas was so huge and she was just bubbling with ideas. So she preferred cinema over art and costume design over painting.
So today, the textiles that we are speaking about, of course, those are the ones that she inherited and are part of her, that you inherited then and are part of your ancestry. And I would just like to actually ask this question to Ms. Radhikaraje, that could you tell us about your exposure to textiles and your work with textiles, and how has it been documenting these antique textiles?
So, Brijeshwari, my exposure to textile is a very, very small and humble way. I can't even, speak when Radhika speaks of her mother and her legacy. My exposure came from because growing up in a similar kind of background where royal textiles were around you. They were a big part of your culture, of the activities, of the occasions revolving around pujas, ceremonies. There were always an occasion where you would wear zari. Zari was very important. I know that grandmothers would only wear silk for auspicious. So puja mein silk hi pehna jata tha, nothing else. So there were a lot of these things which you kind of knew because you saw, your Rena Sena, you were growing up in that traditional background.
So how was your experience in documenting these pieces?
The government service is my father, and we were interacting with people from all parts of the country. And saris was still very much part of, everyday wear when I was growing up in Delhi. So that was my initial exposure. Of course, when I got married, my mother-in-law herself was very, very passionate and knowledgeable about textiles, especially the royal textiles and royal attire, the whole dressing up and what goes with what occasion, what is worn. And she had beautifully preserved all these old textiles for generations from her mother's side as well as her from the in-laws side. So that became a beautiful, ready base for me to explore more and learn more. And of course, the Indian textiles and craft are so varied that you're I'm constantly trying to learn. I'm very, very, very low on the ladder of knowing. I'm just exploring and trying to learn. And being my background in journalism and in history just wants me to look at it academically and study it and know more of the history and background, and which is why the textiles of Bhanuji were a perfect platform, because there's so much of nostalgia, there was so much of coming home. A lot of the textiles are very similar to ours, and yet how she's taken that legacy forward, and the references from her beautiful enriched childhood and her growing up, which the parables were easy to see in her work, which somehow perhaps she herself couldn't see when you see her book, because you're not a spectator of your own work, but when you objectively look at it, and you're able to probably draw references that this is probably someone she saw and was inspired by in her childhood, and this is probably years later it manifested in her work. It's been a very, very exciting journey. It's taught me more about the textiles which I had in our collection as well, seeing her varied collection of textiles.
That actually brings me to asking this question to Ms. Deepthi Sasidharan, because you have worked with archiving so many private and public institutions. I mean, I actually had to condense the bio and just mention a few of them. So how many of these have been related to textiles, and how has the condition of the textiles that you have archived been? How has that?
So if you're working in India, you can run from textiles, but you can't hide. So whether you're working in a collection whether you're working in a collection with jewelry or whether you're working with a collection of actual textiles or any other such, I think textiles in India are intrinsic, and they are used, if not as a main part, they are used to back, they are used to cover, they are used to present. So textiles turn up. Answering your question, I was very lucky very early in my career. I had Shri Martan Singh or Mapu as my boss. And if you are as a young professional, if you're in his team, conversations almost always veer towards textiles and the technical nuances of it. And very early on to have been able to see it and learn from him was a big privilege, which I realize now. And since then, having worked with collections across India, textiles, whether they are embroidered, whether they are woven, presented as actual textile saris or drapes, they're just everywhere. Condition-wise, I think Deepshikha would be a better because whenever we see something we don't understand, she's the person to whom we call for help. It varies really, Brijeshwari, because if a collection is looked after, they are pristine, they're almost new when well stored, put in boxes, and many traditional institutions have had time-honored ways and methods to do that. But sometimes when it's been neglected, left in the open, light, moisture, all of the things we are fearful of get to them, and then they are really damaged. Yeah.
That's very true, actually. I think, Deepshikha, you could probably tell us a little bit about textile conservation. We have several conversations about India being such a culturally diverse land and how each area has its own unique, textile and craft and material that's being used. So how does one go about in terms of conservation of these? Because you have so many designs, patterns, materials that you're dealing with. So
first and foremost, conservation is all about kind of managing the change. It's just like the human body ages, so does all the material that's been constructed. So a conservator is just like a doctor of the objects. So in my case, I would be like a textile doctor, maybe, So basically, whenever an object comes to us, so we try to understand, we try to examine it, first of all, and examination can be an analytical examination, wherein you are looking at the weave structures, the dyes, and its place in history and cultural exchanges. Or then you want to look at the condition assessment, like you were saying. So we've got like almost 80, 90 parameters against which we assess the condition of the object, So so then we document that, and that helps us arrive at how we're going to treat an object.
So the textiles we are focusing on today, the ones inherited by Bhanu Athaiya and then Ms. Radhika. So my question to you, Ms. Radhika, is that could you tell us about your first memory of these? Who was the last one from your family to wear them? And when was this? Were these ceremonially worn? I think you shared a few really beautiful pictures of.
Well, the last time they were worn were at my wedding, where all my aunts and my grandmother, everybody wore the saris. And one of the saris that I wore for the ceremony was a replica of the original Petney. So it was done in pink. But it's quite interesting to see that even though mine was done much later, My mother had it copied. My mother normally never interacts with weavers for her work. So she wanted it replicated for my wedding. So she had it done about in the early 60s. And that has disintegrated, whereas the ones that were there from my grandmother and great-grandmother's time, they seem to be in a better condition, which obviously is because of the yarn used and the gold thread that was used. So, but after that, nobody has worn them. And I remember seeing them when I was very young. I mean, that little baby cape that was used for christening, I was the last baby on whom it was used. And that, you can imagine, was nearly 100 years ago. So after that, they were fragile. My mother didn't want to fidget with them too much. So that was the kind of, it was really kept for, because earlier they were worn for every festival in the family, because there was a family deity downstairs, whether it was the Gauri, Chaitra Gauri Puja, or the Navratri, or Diwali, or Ganesh Chaturthi, whatever. All the saris would come out and everybody would be wearing them. The whole family would be wearing them.
So you actually bring up quite a few interesting points. I think I'll first direct this question to Radhika Raje, that what is a Petney sari? You write these beautiful Instagram posts about, the history and the origin of each sari. So I think a lot of people who probably are attending here may not know what a Petney sari is, or, when it's worn, the tradition of wearing one, because the lifestyles that we all lead today, I mean, like Ms. Radhika Gupta stated about wearing one for these pujas and ceremonies, we don't see that happening so frequently today, largely. So could you tell us a little bit about it?
So Petney was really one of those very refined textiles, which were, of course, patronized by the Marathas, by the Maharashtrian community. Even today, we know that. But previously, there was actually Petney, the town was under the Mughals. And there was also great interest that the Hyderabad the royal family, the Nizam, took in Petney. So this was a very, very obviously already declared royal textile. And originally, it was all cotton. It was hand spun cotton, but the base was very strong. So like how Radhika ji mentioned that this older textiles have survived well is because the cotton was very sturdy. And the weave, the border, which would take sometimes, depending on how complex it would, could take up to a year. So the sari was woven separately and the border was woven separately and then very neatly put together. So it was almost assembled. And then with the influx of weavers coming in from Banaras, there was, because Banaras was always bursting with weavers. There were a lot of weavers there and a lot of them would move out. And a lot of them then took their looms, and with the looms also the jacquard contraption, and came to Yola, and then from Yola to slowly down to Petney. And that's when the jacquard weave came into Petney as well. Earlier it was the extra weft alone. Then the jacquard also started coming in. So some of them, the designs became more complex. And comparatively brought down the price because the labor was less. But Petney has always been a very small weaving center. Even today, I believe they have about 100 homes and 100 weaving centers. So it's very small. A lot of work comes from Yola. Petney is actually woven in Yola and sold there on. But of course, the technique is the same. And you'll see them in all royal portraits of especially Maratha royalty, and they've just kind of lasted, even say in Bhanuji's collection and even in our own collection. I myself have worn, even today I've worn a sari which is over 100 years old and it's absolutely in perfect pristine condition. And the gold is absolutely sparkling. You can't. And the interesting thing is, Brijeshwari, what happened was a lot of these weavers, there were two big fires that happened in Ahmedabad. 1630 and 1700, if I'm not wrong. And a lot of weavers moved out from there. And they moved to Banaras, they moved to Petney. And that's where the designs which would then became popular with the Peshwas called the Ashavali. The Ashavali is otherwise a very, very famous weaving of Ahmedabad. Even now people are working to revive it. And so the border, the motif has retained its name. So there was always this influx happening of weavers from here to there. Sometimes it's very difficult to really say exactly where a sari is woven unless it's very distinctively, otherwise it can be, it's very, very hard to sometimes really pinpoint, because every family, especially royal families or families of nobility, had their own weavers that they patronize. Sometimes they like to weave, they would ask those weavers to replicate or remake it in their color of choice. So a lot of that used to happen. But
that actually brings me to a good question for Deepthi, that you have archived all these lots of private institutions and public. So what are the challenges you have faced while conducting archival research when it comes to textiles? Is it challenging to find information on Indian textiles? When we were having this conversation of documentation for this collection, and there was a lot of information. We were lucky that Ms. Radhika could actually give us a lot of the information, her primary knowledge on her family's heirloom collection. But as a researcher and an archivist, what are the challenges you face while conducting such research?
So I would say there are two major areas, and Radhika has already shown the light on the first thing, and that is the difficulty in pinpointing the technical nuances of a textile. In a country like India, you have a vast complexity of not just of fabric, but also of overlaying, embroideries, decorations, the use, and so on. So it really, when you first look at a collection and you want to document it in some detail, perhaps the greatest challenge is breaking it down into the particular weave. What were the materials used? Because again, like Radhika said, a lot of a part of the whole point of fabric is to make it look like something else. So even if you have cotton weaves, they sometimes mimic silk weaves or what originally began as silk weaves, vice versa, and so on. And that brings me to the other biggest challenge, which is people to document it. I think you were incredibly lucky that you had somebody so experienced, both as a historian as well as someone who's had exposure to fine textiles, to be able to look at it. And even though you may be looking at a collection of a so-called small collection of say 50 or 100 saris, in India that is requires sometimes encyclopedic knowledge. And so that would be I think the second area is trained people who are able to break it down into what you're looking at, where I don't believe any one comprehensive training program exists anywhere that can teach you how to look at textiles. All of us who have journeyed have had to face the simple truth that you have to see, understand, and learn. And
given how diverse, culturally diverse we are as a country, is there even a single platform or a single, database where you have all this information?
There have been several attempts, but nothing that you can readily access. Those who are working in the field can guide you to resources, invaluable, of course. And you have to work between private databases that are usually a lifetime's worth of work, glossaries behind well-known books, textbooks, and materials. And then, of course, this part best, is dipping into a network of friends, researchers, and knowledgeable people. I think I would lean back on the last the most. Every collection requires a specific set of individual specialists. Yeah.
Very true. And I mean, how important, this is for Deepshikha actually, how important is this documentation when you're conserving a particular piece of textile? Because if you don't have that repository of information and that database, how do you actually go about conserving something such as the Bhanu Athaiya collection, for example?
So the thing is, again, coming back to analyzing the weave structures, analyzing the dyes, the materials, the embellishments that's gone in, and then again looking at the condition assessment and all. And like Deepthi said, relying on trustworthy friends, So I often call up Rahul. So whenever I'm stuck, so he's the go-to person.
I do.
Yeah. I mean, that's the fact. Like the other day, I had a lovely carpet that came over for conservation, and I was like, "Oh, it's a voided carpet," and I've not seen a voided carpet before. So where's this from? And the discussions happened, and Rahul was like, "Oh, this is Iranian," So things like that. There was another textile that came in, and again, he also said that, yeah, these have not been published before, and they belong to a rare category. So it's very interesting, and you need these friends to have conversations with.
Yeah, I think, Deepshikha, you actually asked a very important question about one of the textiles from the Bhanu Athaiya collection, and maybe Radhika ji can, maybe tell us a little bit about it, because Deepshikha had mentioned that Chanderi wasn't always done in silk. So were the pieces from the inherited collection, the heirloom collection, were the Chanderi pieces in silk or in cotton, or was it mixed?
I think Radhika Rajeji would be better equipped to answer that, because she's an expert, and I think she would be able to.
Well, up till the 1920s, I believe that it was cotton. Silk came in Chanderi more or less in the 1920s. I'm sure Deepshikha will know better. This is just, again, I'm just learning. But yeah, so mainly saris were cotton. And Chanderi cotton was like, it was like muslin. So it was the finest quality of cotton, again, patronized by the Mughals. So very, very, very refined. And we have those in the collection, and then also some silks. So there's been transition, and some which we believe could have been actually woven in the south, because the motifs, even though the silk is lighter, the motifs are kind of give an indication that they may have been woven in the south as well. And because the Deccan influence was so wide, that it is possible that there was they were from the south as well.
So, I mean, as part of the collection, there was also this Shela, Shalu, as one calls it. And what exactly is this? There was, I think, during the Instagram live that we had with you showed one from a painting, and we had a lot of people asking after that, what painting is this? Who's wearing it? So, of course, there were a lot of questions regarding that particular piece. And what was the tradition, and is it something that is still worn?
Absolutely, it's still worn. I wore Shera at my wedding. It's a much wider textile, and the width is shorter than a sari. So it's like a dupatta, but almost double the width. And as a bride, I wore it for my bridal ceremony. I wore it in the haldi, which is also a very, very important ceremony for Marathas. And that's why even in the collection, you see oranges and yellow in the Bhanu Athaiya's collection, because that yellow and green were very auspicious colors, especially for the functions that were, haldi being a very important function for weddings in our kind of families. So those were, there would be these kara dupattas, which would be very, very wide. And they would be worn by men and women. Either the men would drape them on just one shoulder. Women would take them over the head and both the shoulders. A sword in royal families, a sword is very important. So because I'm bringing this up because of the picture that I showed you that day. My grandfather-in-law actually has it draped over his sword, because if you take a sword for a ceremonial function, it has to be draped in a fabric. So you do not, in any way mislead people to believe you are coming in war. So the ceremonial sword must always have a ceremonial textile fabric over it. So there were many ways that a shera was used, but primarily and by both men and women. Slight difference in size, but very, very important part of even today. I mean, in our kind of families, I'm not sure, but I have worn them.
Radhika ji, maybe you can talk a little bit about the shera that's part of this collection. Is it something that you remember being?
Well, my mama had used it when he got married, for instance, and because he when he sits for the puja, he has to wear silk. So he used that for the puja. And before that, my grandmother says that, before she was widowed, whenever they went out to the temple for some celebration, some festival, she would always take it, and it would cover both her shoulders. And that was the way you stepped out of the house. She never went out without it, except if she went for her regular visit to the mandir to hear some, pravachan or something like that. But otherwise, if she went out for any formal occasion, she would always use it. But my mama has used it an innumerable number of times during pujas. And the family, my grandmother was very particular about all the pujas being conducted the right way. So he, as the only son in the family, he was very much part of that.
So when we speak about ceremonial textiles, and we can't really talk about them without talking about jewelry and shringar and the connect between both of them. And Deepthi's actually written a book, co-authored a book also on, a lot of on jewelry with treasures of the Deccan, if I'm not wrong. So Deepthi, could you tell us about how important or connected is the documentation of jewelry and shringar when we speak about heirloom textiles or antique pieces such as this?
I think the other panelists already brought this up because, it's so interwoven. In India, traditional costume, you could wear a sash, for example, or around your waist, and that's almost always held in place with a belt, which is jeweled, bejeweled. It could be gold, it could be stones, or turbans, which are used in cultures from north to south. And then the turban is made of, it's 5.5 meters of cloth, wound to and placed on your head. This is, of course, for men, both these examples. And then the turban in turn will have a jewel that comes on top of the turban. So, it crisscrosses its ways. For women, we have, again, in South India, you have saris, which rely on a belt to hold it in place, the udyanam. So many jewels are utility based also. We tend to see them today as pieces of precious pieces of jewelry, which of course they are. But you must remember that all jewelry, and I say all, typically began out with some utilitarian purpose. And in that sense, I think, and of course then transcends its way to luxury items, emblems or symbols of power or wealth. But they are, especially in a country like India, almost always have a backing of cloth when worn on the body. Yeah, I think they are woven together. It's you cannot separate the two.
So when we speak about Bhanu Athaiya, we always think of the Oscar-winning Bollywood costume designer. And our costume used in films, archived and documented. And have you had any experience actually doing this?
I have come across, of course, many Bollywood costumes as well as other costumes. But the thing is, you see, in cinema, much like very many other projects, money is always a constraint. And costume design typically lends itself to that shot, that scene, and many costume designers, especially when large, making costumes for large groups of people, have to limit themselves to a budgetary constraint. As a consequence, the fabric that is used mimics something that might be more richer looking, beautiful looking, but is not of a nature that would last very long. So that's one of the things. Also, much like dancers, to give the actors the ability to move around and be able to emote in them, they are also lighter. And these two combine to a large extent to make sure that many cinema costumes don't either get saved or are endlessly recycled. It's just the nature of how they are. But of course, there are some iconic costumes that the designers or the actors or the producers have taken an effort to preserve. I've seen some of them, but I'm not aware of any public publicly accessible large database where you can go and study film costume, and more importantly, the designs that brought them together on paper.
Radhika ji, maybe you could talk a little bit about Bhanu's, because she worked in over 100 movies since the 1950s with so many filmmakers, right from Guru Dutt and Yash Chopra. So where did all these costumes, how were they something that she kept with her, or how did it work?
Well, normally the producers kept the costumes with them, and she worked in about 230 films, not much more than 100. But unfortunately, she would always say that if it was a long shooting schedule, then the costume would degenerate under the bright lights and the makeup, because shooting conditions weren't great in those days. So it was so hot, and the artist would be perspiring, and so the makeup would trickle down, and it would ruin the fabric. So sometimes if there was a long continuity, for instance, she would have to make 2 of the same, or sometimes 3, so that it looked fresh each time. Otherwise, it would have faded patches.
Absolutely. And it was also Bhanu who sort of brought the change from the darzi dresswala to a costume designer. So what were the challenges that she faced in Bollywood while...
Well, there were costume designers before her. There was somebody there was Mani Rabadi, for instance, who did a lot of film work. But hers USP, so to speak, was a lot of research based. Also, she had the advantage of being a one-man army. She would do the sketch, she would have the embroiderer in-house. I've grown up, one area on our veranda was where 3 work areas were prepared for the embroiderers, and there was a separate room for the tailors. So she was constantly hovering over that. She had no control over the fabric because she used to buy it from the market. She never got anything specifically woven. But for instance, like somebody just said about it being light for movement, it was, I think, Deepthi said that. So it, like in the movie Sahib Bibi or Gulam, Meena Kumari was a very voluptuous lady, and she didn't want to wear a dhakai, which tends to bloat out. So she said it would make her look too bloated on screen. And as it is, the screen magnifies it, the camera magnifies your whole person. So my mother created a dhakai on net, so that it was easier for her to carry around. But you couldn't tell at all. And I remember that being done in my house. So those, and there she would be sitting all night. I mean, it was really her passion. It was amazing. I mean, I think I knew from birth that she was a very special person, because that kind of multiple brain ticking along when you're doing something and you're visualizing it and then executing it, doing it all yourself. She did her shopping herself. She picked up the accessories, whether it was jewelry, shoes, bags, the hairstyle. She had something to suggest for all these areas, and she provided those. So it was quite a task, and she liked to do the full look. Like whether it was an Amrapali or it was Lagan, she did it for every single person in the film. So, it is, so she had to she tended to use a lot of khadi, for instance, for the crowd scenes, because that would then, she could manipulate the budget accordingly. So those were things that,
Absolutely. And this is a question to all of you, actually, because we've spoken about Bhanu's inherited this collection of antique textiles. And I mean, the documentation that took place And so where should such textiles, like such collections, be housed? Is it something that should be part of an art museum or a textile museum? And what are your, it's open to everybody.
I think,
and I were, sorry.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Please.
No, I was just saying that any historic textile or object should be housed by anyone who can look after them and feels confident that they can look after them and care for them for at least another couple of generations. And when it comes to textiles, typically they're fragile, they're special. So if you can look after the demands of that, then it's yours to enjoy.
In fact, my mother was, for the last, at least 15 years, we've been hunting around for some museum that would keep her sketches and some of her costumes that are there. But we found absolutely nothing. Nobody was agreeable to start anything. So even the film museum that is in Mumbai, that houses all the cameras, all the technical equipment, and that's it. So there is nothing that has been preserved as yet. Raj Kapoor RK Films had an amazing collection, but very sadly, we lost it in that fire. They had preserved their collection beautifully, but that put an end to that. So that, I don't know where people will invest that money to preserve something like this.
Given how influential the Bollywood industry is, I think prior to the conversation and the panel discussion, we were talking about how influential it is in everyone else's choice of wedding attire or ceremonial clothing. So given that, why isn't there a Bollywood museum? This is a conversation actually that Deepthi and I've had quite a few times. So it's open to everybody.
Also know the answer. It's because there isn't enough money, but I'd like somebody else to have.
Yes.
No, but see, if you have a museum such as that, there is an interest in these textiles. So, and there is an interest in Bollywood. So wouldn't something like that be income generating if you think about it?
I think, Brijeshwari, this kind of a cultural interface must be supported publicly, perhaps by the government. I say this because even to invest in a museum or any kind of a cultural institution that would look after not just the caring of these textiles, you must remember that if it were to be, for example, in the city of Mumbai, just the real estate would not make it viable. But even if you were to take it elsewhere, specialists who know how to look after it, professional staff who can run for it, care for it, and then of course bring into the mix the balance of having people who want to look at it, come see it. It's all just too complicated. And then of course the finger points back to where we start the conversation as to who would do this. I think the expertise on how it can be done exists. But you'll need somebody who loves Bollywood costumes well enough to come there. And I think with all the panelists here, you would agree in some respect or the other, we've all grappled with the idea when you look at a bit of cultural heritage that is important, no questions asked. But when it comes to custodianship and looking after it, it translates into the resources, not just money, resources. The skill, the initiative, the drive, the passion, and that's just so hard to bring together. But of course, conversations like this help because who knows, maybe somebody here is listening.
Just add there,
India is a young country, so hopefully it will happen soon.
Yeah.
I just like to add here that Brijeshwari, the collection, at least what I've had a look at, and the sketches, it's so much more than just a Bollywood collection. It is a window into what yesteryear was and how the way we understand, imagine clothing, drapery, culture to have evolved from then to popular cinema and popular imagination and how people dreamt of dressing up or what they wanted to be look like, whether these were actresses and actors who they looked up to, but more or less that psyche about this is how I want to dress, and it continues to a large extent that these are the trendsetters. But you have parallelly fashion designers today who are also dictating what are the fashion trends or the colors of the runway. At that time, one must understand a person like Bhanu Athaiya, who grew up in a small town like Kolhapur, came and made a mark for herself in Bombay almost instantaneously. Just to think of a girl who was 15, 16 was illustrating and really drawing what people wanted to wear. If film actresses on their own were coming and wanting this girl from Kolhapur to design or make clothes for them. This is the scale of textiles that we are talking of, and the evolvement of grassroots level handicrafted textiles to popular fashion with larger than life and very, very glamorous, and that is so much bigger than just Bollywood. And that reason to
absolutely, I think that's why it's important when you have them in a museum, such as I think Radhika ji mentioned, that to have them curated or housed in a museum and to narrate the story of her younger days, of the influence of that entire, to weave that story. And I think it's more important to have a museum on board or a collection which showcases them to everybody, rather than just an individual probably storing them in their home, right?
But also
just like the Bollywood. Sorry, there's
Deepshikha.
no. You please go ahead.
No, please, Deepshikha.
Okay. So what I was saying was that just like the Bollywood, there's no fashion museum also. There's no costume museum. There could be one that culminates all these aspects together. Yeah, please.
No, for instance, we also don't really have a culture for preservation in that sense. Most houses, if we just dug into the trunks of everybody's grandmothers, we would get such a variety of saris and blouses and, different cuts, different things, that it's always purana ho gaya, phek do. So I think that is another, maybe because we've seen too much history, maybe we don't feel that empathy with it. I don't know what it is, but it is unfortunate. It is unfortunate that we don't really preserve everything with love and care.
Absolutely, it's tragic. And do you think the tradition, though, of wearing a sari, is it something that's still there the way it used to, or is it not as, I know there are like 3 of us on a panel wearing a sari, but still just asking as a whole, with the modernization and cultural exchanges and Western traditions, is that interest still there in people to actually wear saris on a regular basis?
I think you can exclude the few of us. We wear it all the time. I wear it all the time. So
I think it's just a niche really in India that wears it, because in Mumbai city, where do you find the dhobi who will iron your Bengal cotton sari for you, for instance, or will lightly starch it and not have it coming out looking like a papad? So all those things are constraints, and unfortunately the weavers are losing that market, and the niche is creating enough only for a very high market. I think everybody should be, and the ones who wear it on a regular basis would prefer a synthetic, which would be drip and dry. So there you are. What do you do then?
I think definitely the daily wear sari is kind of diminished. We still have the occasion wear saris, so the patolas, they are there, and there is a demand. But the daily wear, the common suti, which was maybe thick, which needs those are the ones one doesn't see anyone wearing anymore, because we don't wear it daily. We wear it for an occasion. So the that's where I feel those weavers and those crafts are dying, which were very much part of day-to-day life.
Very true. So
It's also because of the shift of the handloom to the powerloom sector. So that has also kind of, made an impact there. And, but with the introduction of the powerloom and the jacquard weaves and everything, the production is there for all kinds of materials, So there are copies of the Banarasis and Petneys, even in the much cheaper materials and all available there. So it does inspire some people,
No, and you have the China silk and, those things coming in. So it's always silk and cotton mixed, which you wear for a few years and then it disintegrates. So that urge to buy a sari, which you will pass down to your granddaughter, maybe, I don't think exists so much.
No, it's a very, very niche market, because today, when you look at it, you read the material, it says art silk. What is art silk? It's synthetic, it's not like silk. So let's not call it art silk. I don't know who coined the term art silk.
I think it's very clever, Deepshikha. It's short for artificial.
That's how many get that.
I thought it was artificial, but I didn't realize it was read as art silk. Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, you see, it says there, art silk, and you're like, really?
And this is something I think, Deepshikha, you and I run into many times when people lovingly show us something that's been bought in the past 10, 20 years and say, this is our wedding costume. And both of us kind of know, after all these years, it's almost telepathy that it's not going to last another 20 years. And we're just bound to say, yes, it's very nice. And then we move out. But the moment we see a 100-year-old sari, sometimes some collections you have both drapes, yardage, saris, whatever it is, it really gets us excited, because we know that if you preserve it well, it will go another 100. And that's just the strange time that we are in, that the quality of what we define as fine, not necessarily bound with cloth or cost, has changed. And that's a fact.
You've sort of drawn these similarities between the Petney Shela that's part of this collection with the one of Raja Akalkot, I think. And that's such an interesting, comparison, because one wouldn't have generally just, seen it and thought of that instantly.
So these fabrics, I've been just obsessing over them from the time I've seen them, and everything is just keeping that in mind. And this photograph I chanced upon to see, and it was identical. And, it was just like a jigsaw puzzle falling together. The timeline is the same. We also believe that this textile is from the 1880s, because you see the jacquard used in it. And this portrait is of the Raja who was there passed away in 1870. So it is, it is very, it's very exciting to find something you're looking tangibly at and see it, such an obvious reference of it in yesteryears. And it is a royal textile. You see, when you're holding it, it is, and there you see it, someone wearing it, and it's exactly the same.
So we have a lot of questions that are coming up asking that how does one store old textiles? And I think everyone here can have their own sort of take on that, because y'all have all either stored them yourselves or archived them or conserved them. So
I think the conservator should answer that. Yeah.
So in current day scenario, what we do is we've been using acid-free boxes to kind of store them. But before we do that, we take each and every textile, again, assess the condition, and then customize the solution. If it's a woven flat textile, it can be rolled, but if we are rolling it up, we'll use the acid-free tissue paper layer. After that, if it's a silk, I might use a silk cover outside, or I might use a mull. But one has to be very careful that if you're using a mull, it has to be a washed mull. It does not have any amount of starch, because the starch is going to invite the insects, there. So after that secondary layer, then we use Tyvek. So Tyvek is something that kind of regulates the intake and outflow of moisture. So we wrap it up. I mean, these are the 3 stages in which we wrap it up. And if it's a very significant collection, we go one step ahead and use a layer of Nomex as well. And Nomex is somewhat fire resistant. In the past few years, we realized that, looking at the Indian circumstances where the conditions are not really controlled, no matter what you say and what instructions you give, people are helpless there, in certain manner. So we go back to trunks. So now I customize steel boxes, according to every object or collection. So then these are then further housed in those. So the moment you're putting them in steel trunks, you know that it's not going to rust if there's any introduction of moisture there. You're also safeguarding from the insects and all. And the inflow of moisture is also regulated there. We had this incident, there was a fire at one of the client's place. And thankfully, because these textiles were kind of stored in this manner. So what happened is that they got saved. The Nomex kind of saved them. The Tyvek melted, and because there was an intermediate layer of the silk in between, so Tyvek got hold on to the silk, and so nothing happened. And they were all kind of fine after the fire. So we were glad about that. And no naphthalene balls, please. They're very toxic. Highly toxic to you as well, not just the collections. So do avoid those. Yeah.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add anything to that?
No, please.
No, I think we refer to
wear your textiles. Wear your old textiles is what she's always said, and she's worn it, and I've continued to wear them. And you might have maybe a nip on a rip on somewhere, but it's worth it, because at least if it's been passed down so many generations, you've also kind of added your feel to it and enjoyed it, which is important.
And also hopefully somebody else, your younger generation, sees it and thinks it's okay to wear it, right?
I think it's important to enjoy them and not just look at them only as pieces to be archived and taken so seriously. I think it's very important to interact with them as well.
Correct. I mean, some of the historical textiles that have been found, they've been found like in Berenike or Fustat. So they were the dumps. The Fustats were like the dumping grounds. That's where those textiles have come from. They were not kind of neatly stored and all, but dearly worn and used and then chunked. So yeah, please do wear them, use them.
There's a question to Ms. Radhika ji actually, that Bhanu was trained in Kolhapur and trained in JJ and then studied in France. So how would you describe her style?
She, I think, absorbed the various influences. She just did her schooling in Kolhapur and then she moved to Mumbai. But there were, aside from schooling, there were so many inputs that were literally thrown at her. She was in the midst of that at that period. She was lucky to have been born at that period in Kolhapur with the eye to pick up these nuances. I mean, she even, I must read out a little bit. She was describing how she had gone to visit her aunt in Belgaum. And she found that her aunt wore saris which were different from her mother. Her mother used to wear chanderis during, home wear, everyday wear. Whereas her aunt, the local women in Belgaum used to wear irkal. And the aunt would wear maheshwaris. So it was, and they would there were people who, the Maheshwaris then were, because she was from near Nagpur, they used to wear that, and they were influenced by Banjaras in that area. So they started making blouses which were made in 7 pieces and joined together. Saat tukra, malmal blouses, because summer it was most comfortable to wear that. So it's these influences, local influences, that my mother said that, I mean, I never knew such a thing existed because my mother never wore that. So that education was there. Of course, her art was, talent was honed at the JJ school. And also when she was doing illustrations. But the films demanded different things. She, of course, always said she was a technician. She was always treated as a technician and a backroom person in the film industry. But she was lucky to have had occasion to work with some of the greats, whether it was Guru Dutt, the Chopras, Raj Kapoor, Kumar Shani. She did plays for them. She worked on calendars. So she was able to channel her creativity in different forms. She created costumes for theater, for Hima Devi's every play, she used to normally do Shakespeare's. She used to do the costumes for her year in and year out. So as she grew, she's always remained a student. I have never seen her sitting idle or snoozing or resting. It was always with a book or a pad to doodle. She was always studying. So Western influences for these things, whether it was armies, for instance, say a movie like Amrapali, where the army uniforms had to be created, or Lagan, where the evening wear had to be created for the Westerners. So she had picked up these ideas and then adapted it to our fabrics and our conditions. So it wasn't always exactly the same fabric or the exact layers that they use, say, in Britain, which was a cooler climate. This was all Lagan, for instance, was being shot in Rajasthan or in Bhuj. So, how do you do that? So I think her style evolved because she kept growing. And she continued to remain a student till the end. So I think you have to be like that. You have to keep your mind open and keep studying the things so that you can, she created a path in that sense.
I think from the collection that has been documented, the antique ones, what stood out to you the most?
The midnight blue with the gold buttas. There's a blackish, it's really midnight blue, but lots of people mistake it for black. That was the most stunning sari, which my mother, in fact, wore at my wedding. So it was a stunner. I think the workmanship was so perfect. The gold dots were exact in size and spacing. It was like a work of art.
Chandrakala is very, very special.
I was going to ask you the same question while documenting them. What stood out the most to you?
That is one of the most spectacular sarees. Similar, we do have a similar one in our collection, but the booties are very beautiful. They are done in Jamdani, so they are. It's a very old saree, and it's got this lovely plain gold with the Akruti border, and very, very beautiful. And of course, Bhanuji's worn it so beautifully, draped so beautifully with the Kamar Patta at Radhika ji's wedding ceremonies. And it's so reminiscent of the time or the imagery of the time with Bal Gandharva, the way he wore the saris and which were quite the trends in those days, or also from the iconography of Raja Raivarma paint, the Draupadi oleograph, where you see her dressed almost identical to how Bhanuji is seen in that photograph. It's a spectacular sari even today, absolutely intact.
Could you tell us a little about her working in during the Gandhi film? I mean, the process of that entire film, because I mean, in a lot of the articles that one does read and that are available to everybody, you see that she's speaking about how challenging it was to create those different looks and costumes for each.
But she was given 6 months to research and create. So she, and every single person was dressed by her. Even in that, the Gandhiji's funeral procession, she said she just kept tying dhotis and she lost count after a point, because she was just, one person would keep coming. It was like a factory chain that was happening. And she did a tremendous amount of reference work on that, because you were dealing with a Bengal, you were dealing with Delhi, South Africa. So she had to be very careful about the looks. And at that point of time, thanks to Mahatma Gandhiji, khadi was worn so much. Today, it's not that popular, but it's one of the most comfortable fabrics to wear. Even in our summers. So she had to create, including the headgear, so that you knew that there was somebody from Maharashtra or somebody from Gujarat, somebody from the South, a Hindu or a Muslim. So it was all, there was, and she had the references, of course, of a lot of the photographs of all the political personalities like Nehruji and all that. So there was that different reference material available. And she just stationed herself in Delhi, and that's where she'd come down every weekend and then instruct the tailors here about what to do, and then stuff would get sent. She said she was never exhausted, because every day she'd wake up feeling excited.
Wow, that's amazing.
That is something I think that gives you the energy to just take it on and do it.
I wanted to ask you, Radhika ji, did the foreign film crews go away more, I won't say educated, but aware about Indian fabrics? Because, khadi was the freedom of fabric. There was so much of it culturally that perhaps she was privy to. And she was in many ways the bridge, right, between.
In fact, if someone like John Mollo or the actors even, they said that when they go abroad, they just walk and pick up their costume off a rack. It's not created like this. There's no such facility in India where you can walk in and pick up a hat. You have to get it made. You have to get riding boots made to a specification, to a particular look.
No, this is true, because I was speaking recently to somebody who's acted in Hollywood, and he was explaining that when you work in period dramas or period films where costumes are specific and are outline a specific historical reference, he says there's already so much to draw from. It's not like you're going to a sketchbook and you start. The fabrics are available right down to, the materials, sometimes even shoe sizes, things like that are already available. You can jump into the 16th or the 17th or the 18th century. If I wanted to wear a historical English costume from the 18th century, I dare say I could put it together in 2-3 days. But that's not possible if you're looking at India historical, unless of course it's a sari, but an 18th century, 17th century specific costume.
Well, if you're looking for some particular kind of things, you still have the dresswala in India, where you can get,
But you need help, right? So there has to be a historical person who can tell you what to dress. You
Right.
can't go to the dress wala and tell him ki mere ko ye de do. They won't.
They won't know. And for instance, when my mother made costumes for Swadesh, when Shah Rukh Khan was in NASA, those shots when he was supposed to be in the US, all those clothes were tailored in India at her workshop.
Amazing, amazing.
She never bought anything from there. And she said that, it was at 1/20th the cost. So she said it made sense that you can make it here. Everything is possible, is doable here.
But is it the cost factor? I mean, purely the cost factor that kind of made her do this? Or is it that the budgets were also low?
No, the budgets are always tight. Budgets,
Always. All kinds of.
there is always, and most, in fact, just recently they had a Zoom talk for Lagan, because they were celebrating being together for 25 years or something like that. And they were all saying how every day they would be checking. The producer would say, listen, you guys are getting beyond budget. Kindly cut down on dates, cut down on people. Don't get any more people in because we cannot afford it. So when you're doing such a large scale film also, when you need that manpower, you need to dress them up. You need the funds for that. And similarly for Richard Attenborough, but fortunately Richard Attenborough had all the costumes done here, except for some of the military uniforms which John Marlowe brought from England. Otherwise, everything else was done here.
Yeah, I read somewhere that, she took on for that final funeral cortege scene. There were close to, I think, although in white, there were close to, I think, 3 lakh costumes. And she didn't blink. She didn't blink, presuming she didn't, because that is like if someone told me, it's not for the faint-hearted, right? If someone told me I need.
Phased her. It never phased her. It was amazing. I mean, the Hindi film industry, like all industries, I'm sure, are a little disorganized. So suddenly at 8 or 9 o'clock at night, she'd get a phone call saying, "Kal subah shoot hai. Kal humko 1 baje tak costume chahiye." So for that kind of situation, she did have stuff in stock. In fact, there are a lot of things from Gandhi, which the crowd scenes, so to speak, used. Because she had to keep certain stocks available, which she could then either remodel or redo for a particular film.
Recycle, I imagine.
Yes.
So much of fabric, right?
Definitely. And you can't really destroy it if it's in perfect condition. So you can't just get rid of it. And she got the opportunity. She got amazing, I think all the good films, she even say something like a Siddharth or a Gandhi came here, wasn't made in Hollywood. It was made in India. So that I think was very lucky for her.
I think Swadesh and Lagan, both she won the national award for.
That's right.
To have Gandhi with the Oscar. And I think one of the questions, and maybe this is very befitting as a concluding question, is that why was her Oscar speech so short?
As it is, my mother wasn't a very talkative person. And she was totally taken aback, even though everybody kept telling her that, it's such a magnum opus and huge canvas. I'm sure you're going to get it. Other nominees kept telling her that. But at that point of time, I mean, that is my mother. She is, her speech was so correct that it was, thank you, Richard Attenborough, for focusing world attention on India. And that, sadly, her pride in India, in a way, let her down because she was never even awarded the Padma Shri. So there you are. That was one sorrow she carried with her.
Maybe we and there would be a more befitting tribute to her in the years to come, I think.
But she was, otherwise, as she said she was so satisfied with the kind of palette that she got to work with, that, especially she was in the film industry from 50 to 80, for 30 years, there was a lot of variety. So even the run-of-the-mill movies still had somebody wearing a salwar kameez, if nothing else, or a sari or something. So even that was there. Every day, Ghar Ghar Ki Kahani type of movie would have that. So, but like even for L.V. Prasad Productions, all their films, she did everybody's, whether it was the bhabhi or the niece or the grandmother, everybody's costume she would do.
I hope you're putting down your memoirs, because
well,
now that you said that nobody preserves, now you have to.
I know. No, it's. I mean, she's a phenomenon. So I think it is just, one is so grateful to have them as my parents. So it was just amazing, just amazing.
It's amazing, like, she would research so well, and she did the period and the commercial cinema with, like.
And she had decided when she made the sketch, she had already visualized what its look would be like. So when it was executed, it matched the sketch perfectly to the T. So, there was no having to cut corners, because she knew exactly what she wanted. And once the director signed off on that and said, this is okay, pick this, pick that, it was it. I mean, she even did costumes for the dresses, uniforms for the ITC group staff. So, it's not that she's dabbled in everything.
Very true. And I think that, like Deepthi mentioned, I think I really do hope that there is a museum or some kind of a place where these path-breaking women and men who have contributed so much to Indian history, textiles, and the Bollywood industry get the recognition that they well deserve. So on that note, I would really like to thank everyone here for coming and participating and paying this tribute for the late Bhanu Athaiya. She has been an influential part of many designers, costume designers, artists, and has inspired us all during this research as well. So thank you so much. Thank you, Radhika ji. Thank you, Maharani sir. Thank you, Deepthi. Thank you, Deepshikha.
Thank you.
Having you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.